And we're good.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to Thomas's Torture Time. That's the name of my show. But welcome to a conversation with Richard Winfield. I had to make sure it wasn't Wakefield. I thought it was earlier, and I was like, oh, it's not Wakefield, it's Winfield. Okay. Well, Richard, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. I might add that I use my middle name in everything, Dean Winfield, D-I-E-N,
Richard Dean Winfield.
and
Okay.
then I'm uniquely searchable because there are other Richard Winfields out there, but there is only one Richard Dean Winfield.
Smart.
Richard Dean Winfield. Okay. Well, everybody out there listening and in the future, remember that so that you can find all this man's work. Um, so, like I said earlier, I usually get these talks started just super informally, and to be honest, I did almost no research into you. Know, I just
Sure.
I wanted to be organic. Um, I do know, however, that you're very interested, or do you teach?
I've been teaching for about 45 years.
Oh,
The
okay.
last 40 years at the University of Georgia in the philosophy department.
University of Georgia. Okay, so that I imagine that is a main source of your time, right? It's not a part-time thing; it's a full-time
It's full
gig.
time, but it's a position where I've had a tremendous amount of time to do writing.
Oh,
So my
excellent.
24th book of philosophy is I'm currently proofing the galleys. And
Do you have some other? Do you have some of the other books that you've written? How many books have you written? Let's tell the audience. How
well,
many
there
have
are
you?
24 books,
Okay.
and I purport to be a philosopher, who's hungry
Well,
for
by
thinking the
every by
truth.
every means that I've learned about you, you are, sir.
Well, what that means is I am not a specialist.
Yeah.
And if you really want to think the truth, you realize that you can't just take up any topic whatsoever in the manner of a positive scientist who takes for granted their access to what they're addressing
Mm-hmm.
and and start with some predefined content. Philosophy can't do that. Otherwise, you're stuck doing investigations that are relative to these two assumptions. One, that your subject matter has a given character and that you have adequate access to it. Philosophy, whether it likes it or not, has to question the given, and it has to really develop a freedom in both a positive and negative sense. It has to be able to free itself of all assumptions, free
Mm-hmm.
itself of kowtowing to any authority, freeing itself of any hold to the alleged given, and on the other hand, to be fully self-responsible, to be
Mm-hmm.
able to account for whatever it makes use of, which includes anything that it might claim is a method, as well as anything that might give definition to its subject matter.
Well, you're
So
talking.
this, yeah,
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say you're talking to two philosophy nerds.
yeah.
We bow down to you, sir. But
Okay.
we're here to learn. But we are philosophy nerds, and we love it. And I was just going to ask it. So if teaching is taking up most of your time, you obviously teach a lot about continental philosophy and idealism and things like that, right?
Well, actually, I wouldn't say that I'm a continental philosopher or anything of that sort. I'm inspired most by Hegel,
Yeah,
but an
yeah.
interpretation of Hegel that regards him as doing systematic philosophy without foundations, and as actually being a pioneer of what I think is the third fundamental approach to philosophy. And I think it is one that solves the sort of problems that afflict the two other fundamental approaches. The one, which is that with which really philosophy has historically begun in both the Western and Eastern traditions,
Mhm.
namely a philosophizing that begins by trying to arrive at what is the ultimate foundation of what is,
Yeah. First
an
principles.
ultimate foundation that, in a sense, provides both for the being and the intelligibility of what is. So, in a sense, it takes ontology as foundational, as first philosophy.
Yeah.
And in doing so, uh, it attempts to get at what is beyond all assumption. It doesn't want to be uh, an enterprise that starts with any unexamined givens,
Mhm.
any unexamined authorities, but it's searching for what it presumes to be unconditioned, not presupposing anything else, and that which at the same time is the basis for the being and intelligibility of anything else. So you've got to know this if you're really going to know anything else with any certainty. But alas, those who have undertaken this quest, which has obviously a very plausible character to it, they find themselves in this position where there's no real way to validate one first principle against other competing candidates.
Mm-hmm.
And that's precisely because a first principle as such is not something that can rest on any reasons. Because if it did, it would not be first, it would be derivative.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you can't, in a sense, vindicate it indirectly by claiming that everything can be shown to derive from it. Because that
Like
presupposes that you
contingency.
have an independent access to everything else
Mm-hmm.
and can somehow claim to know what everything else is, as well as claim to know how it can be derived from this alleged starting point. So, what do we have in philosophy? We have, for much of Western philosophy, competing candidates for first principle of being, starting with water, with nous, with self-thinking thought, with the good, et cetera, et cetera. You have something similar in the efforts of Eastern philosophy, which I think is the other major
Yep.
philosophical tradition on our lonely planet. But this leads to an impasse. And it leads to an impasse also because of something else that was pointed out by the pioneer of the second fundamental option, namely Kant.
Yeah.
He pointed out if we begin by trying to arrive at a first principle of what is, if one wants to make philosophical investigation begin with ontology, by trying to account for what is,
Yeah.
we're taking for granted the authority of our knowing, our thinking.
Yeah. Of our epistemology.
And
Yeah.
that obviously needs to be not taken for granted.
I don't
Now,
think so.
this leads to another approach, which still makes appeal to a foundation. But now the foundation from which one proceeds is not a foundation of a first principle of being, but in a sense, a structure of knowing that is taken to be the foundation of what we can know to be objective.
Yeah.
And in a sense, Kant is the great pioneer. He construes this foundational epistemology as a matter of understanding how self-consciousness can be regarded to determine the character of what we can know. And there are other competing versions of this. Whenever you make epistemology the foundation, that is where you take our access to what is as being determined by whatever we take to be the structure of knowing or that which provides access to what is. This can be understood in terms of consciousness, like Kant. A consciousness he regards to be something that precisely because it has this Archimedean role of determining what we can take to be objective, is not something that has an object-like character. It has what he would call a noumenal character. It is something that stands over and against everything that can be taken to be objective. Others regard this as problematic. We need to think of the knowing structure as something in the world because we are making claims about it, but we're saying that the only valid knowledge we can have is knowledge of objects as they are given to our structure of knowing. So you have others who want to take this foundational structure as a cognition that is very much in the world. You have people like Heidegger doing that, taking a concrete, not noumenal, subjectivity that is in the world, that has care, that has a facticity, that has, in a sense, practical interest and the like. Others will turn to language, the very intersubjective practice, which is very much in the world, as being determinative of what we can think, what we can know, what we can talk about. Now, all of these maneuvers of what we can call foundational epistemology, or since Kant, it comes to be known as transcendental investigation. They, on the one hand, are privileging a certain candidate for what they take to be the ultimate structure of our knowing, be it construed as consciousness, as language. Others do it in terms of epistemological power structures like Foucault, or various thinkers who want to say that our knowing is actually socially determined by various
socially
power
constructed.
interests and the like.
Yeah.
Well, in all these cases, something very common is going on. Something is being characterized as being the ultimate epistemological foundation. It's given a certain character, and it is regarded as being determinative of what we can know. Now, that itself leads to a fundamental impasse. First of all, one is really doing something that is just as dogmatic as traditional ontology. Because whereas traditional ontology was ready from the get-go to start addressing the character of what is, of getting at the first principle of being, foundational epistemology, whether it be Kant or Heidegger or Husserl or Foucault or those doing feminist epistemology and the like,
Yeah.
they are reading off just as directly the character of what this epistemological foundation is. And their knowing of it is not what is under scrutiny. They take for granted their knowledge of what the conditions of knowing
Yeah,
are.
this is the meta epistemological assumption that they make, right?
Yeah. And the reason why they can't help but take for granted rather than establish the authority of the knowing they are exercising as a foundational epistemologist
Mm.
is that the knowing they are wielding in investigating the foundations of knowing is different from the knowing they are putting under inspection. Because the
Mm.
knowing they are investigating is a knowing of objects, but they are engaged in a knowing of knowing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're being completely dogmatic about it. And there are other problems that come into play, because if you regard the structure of knowing, whatever it may be, it could be construed as language, ordinary or ideal, it could be consciousness that is over and against the world, or a consciousness that is embedded in the world, etc. This leaves knowable objectivity as something that is relative to that structure. And in that regard, something that could be regarded as being conditioned. And in being conditioned, it falls into this character of being a domain which is inhabited by objects that can only be known as being conditioned entities,
That's
as being
interesting.
determined by that structure of knowledge. So if you look at Kant, you look at the avatars of linguistic philosophy, they construe knowable reality as a world that is conditioned by an external necessity.
Hmm.
It is a world that ends up being governed by efficient causality, a world that has no room for life or for the very subjectivity of the knowing that they are presupposing when they're operating.
Hmm.
Now, Hegel is someone who calls into question foundational epistemology, or the whole transcendental enterprise.
Yeah.
And he regards it as being just as dogmatic as foundational ontology. And he pioneers the attempt to recognize that philosophy cannot make use of any foundations. It can't begin by making any claims about what is or about knowing. It can't begin with any such presuppositions. It can't claim to have a method in hand. It can't claim to have any privileged standpoint.
Yeah.
It really has to begin, in a sense, with indeterminacy. And another way of looking at this, of characterizing these three approaches, which I think really exhaust the possibilities,
Okay.
is either you take truth and anything that involves justification, such as right, such as
Right.
beauty, right? You can think of these three domains of what is normative, of what is justified.
Yeah.
Truth, pertaining to knowledge; right, concerning valid conduct; beauty, concerning that which is held to have aesthetic worth.
Yeah. Aesthetic
Uh,
virtues. Yeah.
yeah, you can regard these things as either having their validity in virtue of some privilege given that they exhibit, which is pretty much the approach of those versions that appeal to a first principle.
Yeah.
Or if you take the transcendental approach, you regard what is ultimate as not being some given that is immediately there,
Yeah.
but rather a privileged determiner of what is held to be valid. So
I
you
never
think,
thought about it like
so,
that.
and that, by the way, is in a sense the approach that the Enlightenment takes. It wants to get at what is autonomous, but it takes the autonomy of thought, which allows it supposedly to not take anything for granted. It regards that as a foundation. It does the same thing with regard to conduct by engaging in the kind of argument of social contract theory, which takes freedom as a first principle in the
Yeah.
form of a liberty a willing given by nature. It does the same thing with regard to beauty, by regarding beauty not to reside any longer in exhibiting a privilege given as in the mimetic theory of Plato and Aristotle,
Yeah.
but rather in terms of the theories of taste, of reception,
Yeah.
where it's a certain structure of reception that is determinative of what counts as beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, so here you have an appeal to normativity in terms of what is a privileged determiner of what is determined by it. The other approach is to regard self-determination as that in which validity consists. Truth is going to reside in the autonomy of thought. Valid conduct is going to reside in self-determination.
Mm.
And in some regard, aesthetic worth is going to regard in the autonomous, the autonomy of artistic creation, which manages to, in a sense, produce entities in which you have an individuality that is fraught with significance, where you have something whose every sensuous detail is part and parcel of what gives it its value.
Mm.
Unlike something that is merely, for example, a product of making, of artisanship, where you start with a preconceived blueprint and then you impose that on materials, all of which, in a sense, are examples of the same blueprint, where what
Yeah.
distinguishes them as individuals is not
So
as
so
significant.
it's like all these givens,
Yeah,
just like they don't have to be there, right?
yeah,
Philosophy is better if the givens aren't there, right?
yeah. Now, another way of putting it is to think about the problem of foundationalism and how one gets around it. Because
Yeah.
you can look at the search for first principles. It
Yeah.
begins with ontology, and equally the search for the conditions of knowing, where epistemology is first philosophy. They
Yeah.
both are making appeal to foundations. One set of foundations consists in some privilege given that is taken to be the ultimate bedrock of everything that is.
Right.
And then you have another foundation, which is that structure of knowing that
Yeah.
determines what we can understand to be
I
objective.
see what you mean by building off the ontology. I get what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Now there's an obvious problem with any kind of foundational justification, and we are so ingrained with assuming that that's what it is involved in justification.
I've
That
told
you need
people
to
that
find
I'm
reasons for what is valid. That
yeah,
you need,
in normative justification, I'm fine with infinitism.
yeah, I mean, think of it this way: we always presume that what is true, what is right, what has beauty, owes its validity, be it epistemological, be it practical, be it aesthetic, to something that confers that validity upon it, some foundation. And there's a distinction drawn between that which is the source of validity and that which possesses validity. And we think in those terms. We think that something is right because it derives from something that confers
Right.
rightness to it.
Something that
Likewise
gives it
with regard to
justification. Yeah.
right. Likewise with beliefs, there's some reason separate from them, etc. But you can see that if you think of justification in those terms, that there's something that is the foundation of what has validity, whether it's theoretical validity, practical validity, aesthetic validity. You then want to ask yourself, what gives that foundation its authority? Because the foundation has two things about it. It has a certain content, and then that content is given a kind of unique privilege
Hmm.
of providing validity to everything else. But
Yeah.
on its
So this
very own,
unique
yeah,
privilege
yeah,
is like you said, privilege bearer a moment
yeah,
ago. Is that correct?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Now think of it this way: the foundation itself is something whose authority can be questioned,
Yeah.
and on its own terms, the only way in which it could have authority is from itself, because it is the source of validity. So
So
if you question the foundation on its own terms and demand that it be, shall we say, self-referentially consistent, it is only going to be valid if it's grounded on itself, if it is determined by itself.
So now that we've laid out kind of these
Yeah.
foundations or these anti-foundations, we could also say perhaps, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about Hegel and or Kant, as you mentioned, because it
Yeah,
seems as though Kant, even all the way back to Plato,
yeah,
these guys try to kind of coalesce both their ontology and their epistemology in a sense. Um, we have this distinction between determined phenomena in the sense of Kant, and then noumena in freedom, in rationality, as Kant would say. And you kind of brought up the differences that Hegel had, and calling him a dogmatist. Hegel perhaps called Kant and whatnot. Hegel as well seemed to take this Kantian view of rationality and freedom, which is, well, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it is the Geist. It is something immaterial. It is separate from nature. And though this is his metaphysics, it still overlaps. Here comes the overlapping of this ontology and epistemology. Perhaps it overlaps with physics and nature and whatnot. And I'd love to hear. I mean, I am a Continental nerd.
yeah, yeah.
I don't take too much of it seriously. It's pretty much all myth as far as I can. It's poetry is my charitable reading. But so I mean Hegel, Kant. I know you brought up some distinction between the two. Um, but what would you say about Hegel specifically? And I guess you might have to bring up Kant with his foundations and his first principles.
There are no first principles in Hegel.
Fair
There are no
enough.
foundations.
Fair enough.
He regards the appeal to foundations and first principles as inherently dogmatic and ultimately unphilosophical. And one way he does it uh, is by pointing out that, in a sense, when you're dealing with the move of any kind of transcendental philosophy, that is, any kind of attempt to get away from dogmatic appeal to what is, and instead to turn to investigate knowing as what comes first in order thereby to determine what we're qualified to know. Making that move, taking that transcendental turn, presupposes that knowing and its object are distinct so that we can turn to investigate knowing
Yes.
without making claims about the object. But Hegel points out, he does this in the very big opening of his Science of Logic in the introduction on the nature of logic, that if you consider knowing to be, or if you consider thinking to be about something other than itself, if you regard, for example, philosophical investigation as to always involve a distinction between what we might consider to be the subject and the object of the investigation, or method and subject matter,
Yeah.
where we're thinking about something other than the thinking we're using,
Mm.
then we can't possibly be uncovering the truth. Because if our thinking is distinct from what we are thinking about, we are taking for granted our thinking because we are investigating something other than it. It is not what we're putting under scrutiny.
So thinking
And
is self-referential.
we're thinking about something else, and we're thinking about something else that itself has a given identity that we're taking for granted,
Hmm.
which minimally is that it's a given over and against thought.
That's what I'd call a useful fiction, that identity.
Right? Well, in this regard, Hegel points out that we have to overcome this assumption that has taken hold of philosophy since Kant, that takes what Hegel would call the opposition of consciousness as being the ultimate cage of thinking, where we think of thinking as always being a thinking about something opposed to it. And we find that really prevalent in the reigning, let's say, orthodoxy that rules the academy, that rules the publishing houses, that rules the academic journals, which basically, for example, treats formal logic as if it had something to do with philosophical reason. And you probably know from your college experience that in philosophy departments in the United States and much elsewhere in the world, the only class you have to take is a class of formal logic.
Mm-hmm.
But formal logic can't possibly be the model of philosophical thinking, because formal logic, as formal, regards thinking as empty. as being incapable of generating any content of its own. It regards thought as having given operations and having to look outside itself to have any content. In other words, it regards thinking as being incapable of arriving at truth on its own. All thinking can do, if it is modeled after formal logic, is, in a sense, certify the consistency of certain reflections upon givens. Because formal logic is always beginning with P's and Q's and axioms and so forth,
Yeah.
none of which it can establish for itself. And the other side of it is that if you regard thinking as having this formal character, then what do you reduce philosophy to? You reduce philosophy to something that cannot get at the truth on its own. All philosophy can do, and you see this institutionalized in academic philosophy in the United States and much of the world.
So,
Philosophy can only engage in formal logic. It can engage in philosophy of science. Reason can't tell us anything about nature. All we can do is reflect upon the consistency of empirical science. Likewise, when it comes to ethics or aesthetics, philosophy, reason can't determine what is right or what has aesthetic value. All we can do is reflect upon our given moral intuitions and engage in a reflective equilibrium of roles, or we look at how terms are used in language and see what will allow them to be consistently clarified. And that way we have a thoroughgoing assault on reason, which is making claims that, by the way, are not analytic in character. These are very positive claims about the fruitlessness of reason. And
so
you have, as the other side in the so-called Continental tradition, rampant in the view that comes to a head in postmodernism.
if I
And
say
that's, yes,
that
go on.
if I say that there is no foundation, there is no first principle in which you can't presume or you must presume, whatever the case may be, wouldn't that itself be a first principle and a foundation? The the dismissal of a foundation
I
or
mean,
a
it's interesting you say that
presupposition?
because Hegel, in a sense, would agree with you that we can't just start by saying, okay, we're going to begin without foundations, and in that regard, embrace an autonomous reason that is what it determines itself to be. And if we regard self-determination as that which does not fall prey to the difficulties of foundationalism, you have to regard that self-determination has no given character because it is what it determines itself to be.
And you mean by character like no first principle quality? Is that what you mean? Yeah.
No character, no given
Yeah.
whatever. And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a mistake of the Enlightenment and liberalism, which reduces freedom to liberty, to a natural will. That is the faculty of choice, basically,
Mm-hmm.
which it takes to be, in a sense, primary, and then derives institutions that are legitimate insofar as they, shall we say, protect that kind of liberty or realize that kind of liberty and
Is
so forth.
there freedom? Is there a such thing as freedom then,
Well,
if we're
well,
taking that
well
away?
I mean, if one of the perplexing things about self-determination, if we want to talk about it, not only with regard to the autonomy of reason, but the autonomy of willing,
Yeah.
is that you find this in a Republic, in a very interesting passage where Socrates is saying, if you think about self-control, which is kind of a stand-in for self-determination, it's really kind of completely unintelligible, because how can the same thing both be what is controlling and what is controlled? Be both agent and patient. This is incomprehensible. It goes against the principle of non-contradiction. And so
Yeah.
what does Socrates suggest?
That
When it comes to the
an
soul, we
organized
have to think
soul.
about,
Yep,
we have to divide the soul into two
yep.
parts, a
Organized
ruling
soul.
part and a
Exactly.
part that's ruled. We have to divide the polis into a ruling class and those that are ruled by it. And in a certain sense, Socrates is right. If you take the will, the individual will, it cannot be self-determining if it simply acts upon itself or upon other things, because it is making use of a faculty of choice, which first of all has a given character that is always at hand in any choice that is made. That character of being a choosing will is formal in that it is present no matter what choice you make. So the choices are not determined by the will, they're given to it. In both respects,
This
we have a
smells
willing
of,
to not self-determined.
yeah, this smells of like a problem of a criterion.
Well, what resolves the problem is to recognize that self-determination when we're concerned with conduct is something that is an intersubjective process, or it's a structure of interaction. And you can get a hold of this when you recognize it. If we're talking about self-determination as a practical task, it's a matter of not just determining what you will, but determining the form of one's agency. Instead of having a given agency like the will we have by nature, which is the capacity of a choosing will. If we're going to be self-determined, we have to give ourselves an agency that is a product of our own willing. We have to give ourselves an agency where we have willed who we are in that capacity. And that means we're dealing with an agency that is not natural, but artificial, conventional. And that is something we can only do when we participate in structures of rights. And to give you an example, the most simple example is what's involved in determining oneself as an owner of property. You can't do that by acting upon things independently of other agents. Because you can grab something, you can mark it, and do whatever you want with it, but that doesn't make it something you own.
Right.
You have to be recognized by others who themselves are equally.
Yeah, ownership is like a social construct.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a social reality. It's not just a construct.
It's
it
a
exists
reality. You're right.
in a type of practice.
Yeah.
And the first part of it is, of course, is each prospective owner achieving recognition by others as exclusive owner of their own body. Because if you can't be recognized to be the owner of your own body, you are a thing that can be appropriated by others.
Right.
Nothing you do can count as your own. And that's something that can't be alienated. Other things that you can take possession of by entering into an interaction with others where you are recognized to have put your will in something that is different from what they have put their will in, that provides you with, in a sense, the most minimal form of self-determination. You have made yourself an owner at the same time as others have done the same. And you're exercising a range of, let's say, a prerogative of choice that is inherently compatible with that of others who participate in that practice. The ultimate side of this is self-government, is determining yourself as a citizen. That involves engaging in the practices of self-government, which you can only do by interacting with other citizens.
Yeah.
And in doing that, the various activities you engage in, running for office, voting, etc., joining in party activities, those you can only legitimately do in a way that does not prevent others from doing the same. And the same thing takes place within the family. If we have the family emancipated as being a joint household which is co-determined by its members, instead of being subject to various hierarchies of natural
hierarchy.
Right? Likewise, in a free society, markets provide a structure of right, because in a sense, in the market, we face one another as commodity owners.
Yeah.
And we can only satisfy our need for the commodities of others by satisfying their need for our commodities. That doesn't mean there are various inequalities that can arise that can in a sense, impede the freedom that we can exercise in society. But you need that kind of reciprocity in plural relations.
Yeah.
And Hegel is someone who tries to think through the structure of self-determination. I think he doesn't think the spheres of the family, of civil society, and state properly. He's unable to free himself of some of the existing institutions of his day.
So, real quick, what is the metaphysical self-determination? What would, if it's not a first principle?
It can't be a first principle because we're dealing with something that can only be what it determines itself to be. It doesn't have a given character.
So self-determinism is itself, period, right?
Well, if you think about where philosophy is going to begin, if it's not going to make immediate claims about what is or about knowing.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then either you're doing foundational ontology or foundational epistemology. You begin, as Hegel attempts to do in his Science of Logic, by making no claims whatsoever.
Yeah.
You begin with indeterminacy. You could call it being if you want. And
Yeah.
by the way, one of the stumbling blocks of ontology, which is always concerned with trying to get at the character of being,
Yeah.
is that if the moment you try to give being any determinate character, you're no longer talking about being. You're talking about
You've
a
changed it.
specific being.
Yeah.
Being can't help but be indeterminate. And in Hegel's Science of Logic, he attempts to work this out. Now, I want to step back and give us another kind of threefold
Sure.
categorization of the world we face. Because here I've presented a kind of anatomy of the paths reason can take in trying to get at truth, which have their parallels in what's involved in trying to get at what valid conduct is or what aesthetic worth is. Either you make appeal to something given, some privileged first principle that is, or some privileged determiner, or that which is self-determined.
Mm-hmm.
You can also think about projects of civilization in the same way. There is a project of civilization that takes what is of value to be something given, something that, shall we say, is traditional, something where, shall we say, it's what our ancestors have been doing,
Right.
right? You can have a notion of a civilization that instead makes appeal to some privileged determiner. It could be a structure of liberty.
I see the threefold you're making. Yeah.
Yeah. Or you can have an approach that regards self-determination as that which is taken to be valid. I would want to maintain that what distinguishes modernity as a normative project, not as just what is happening now, because what is happening now, or for the last several centuries, has been a slaughterhouse of competing, contesting projects.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there is a project to establish a civilization where what is taken to be valid in conduct are institutions that are the reality of self-determination, that recognizes what we take to be true to be based upon an autonomous reason. And you have, and I think that is a modern project that
Right.
has two things opposing it. One is pre-modern projects that make appeal to privileged foundations, privileged traditions, and the like. And then you have a postmodern project.
Okay.
And the postmodern project really takes the view that indeed reason and all attempts to produce values
Mm.
always proceed from foundations, and the foundations are always
Yeah.
arbitrary and
Yeah.
particular.
Skepticism. Yep.
Well, not just skepticism. This is the view of Nietzsche that, in a sense, regards what is taken to be rationality is really just an exercise of a will to power.
Oh,
It's a
yeah.
will
Yeah.
to power because what are we doing? We're putting forward what are presumed to be universal standards of truth, of right, of beauty, but
Mm-hmm.
they all issue from foundations. And
Yes.
the foundations can't possibly be justified. They're arbitrary. They're there because, in some respect, someone has put them forward. And in
Right.
putting them forward, they're foisting them on everyone else. It's a
What did
power
you call it? Something bearer?
will to power.
No, you said you had a term earlier that you used,
Yeah.
and you called it not a truth bearer, but a something bearer. Man,
Yeah.
now I
Well,
forgot it.
bearer of validity, of
Yeah, bearer
justification.
of yes, that's it. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So I mean, that's how Nietzsche takes his view, and I think postmodernism is working with that. And the way you can give this a positive spin, as Nietzsche does, is that insofar as all efforts to put forward values are really conditioned upon, in a sense, the arbitrary will, whoever is sticking them in front of us and trying to impose them on us all, is to recognize that one could do this in a way that's consistent. Namely, one recognizes that the values one is putting forward are not universally valid, they're particular. And they're coming from me or my group. And we're going to assert them and shove them down everyone else's throat. And that, in a way, is the ultimate foundation of fascism.
It
Not a
is.
fascism
Right.
that believes that there is really some natural superiority, rather a more, shall we say, philosophically sophisticated fascism that regards all foundations as arbitrary and says the only consistent thing to do is to make no bones about the arbitrariness of what one is doing, one is making a power play, one is asserting the particularity of who we are, and
So
I
just
think
go
we're in a
with it,
world in which we
basically.
have a resurgence of that. We have, shall we say, this call it populist nationalism, where
Oh yeah, no, I know what you mean by
ancestry
that.
is being
Yes.
privileged and
Yeah.
rights are regarded as being fraudulent,
Yeah.
as really, as Nietzsche would say, really a mask for the power play of some group that is attempting to assert
And
itself.
I mean, I love and I hate Nietzsche,
Yeah,
and I get. I mean, I fall more under the camp of the knowing, which you seem to criticize, or at least bring up the criticisms brought to that idea of the
yeah,
knowing, the rational. I mean, I get it. It could just be all a will to power play. Even the priest, even the philosopher who chooses to give some sort of information or knowledge based thing, that's just at bottom will to power. What I want to hear more so, and if you want to take this somewhere else also, Thomas, say something, but I want to hear your perspective, since you seem very learned, of course, on Hegel and Marx, and how Marx kind of, as Nietzsche was also a destroyer of metaphysics, shall we say, Marx kind of just took the Hegelian idea, but without the geisty immaterial stuff. And he took the material, took nature, took this one world that we know of, at least know of, and the relationship of, again, knowing, because again, I fall more under the camp of freedom, if it is such a thing. I mean, again, this could just be another useful fiction. I act as though I have freedom, and I use it based on my power, my physicalness, and I use it as well based on my rationality. And I kind of, combine the two in order to be free. Now, what Marx did, I thought was great. I thought that these two people, uh, they worked very well together. Hegel kind of laid down whatever poetry, as I called it, and then Marx kind of took it seriously. And the end of history, I don't know. I mean, it seems as though you're talking more about Hegel's logic of science and whatnot. I maybe this is a better thing to ask you. What do you think of Hegel's end of history and his Geist, and how all of humanity is just one spirit of knowledge, and how we get this from the Enlightenment and manipulating nature and whatnot, which Marx would end up taking and running with. I
yeah.
mean,
I mean, first of all,
what are your thoughts on that, telos?
Hegel is not a dualist. He does not think of mind as something separate
Mm-hmm.
from nature, um, or being disembodied.
They're
Right.
coalesced for sure,
I mean,
absolutely.
when he conceives of all the dimensions of mind, it's always an embodied mind,
Yeah.
and a mind that is interacting in the world
Would people
with
back
other
then
minds.
ever use the terms mind dependent and mind independent, or is that something of a recent kind
I mean,
of
they would use something similar,
yeah, okay.
sure. But one thing I want to point out, there's a lot of, I think, things that are completely misguided about what Hegel is doing about with regard to history, because people kind of assume that Hegel had a descriptive philosophy of history. In other words, he had a philosophy of history where reason could think what historical development necessarily is, what character it has, what direction it has, and so forth. And I think that's completely wrong. And I think, by the way, and this is something that will be relevant when I just turn to Marx in a moment. If you look at all of the great philosophers, when they're dealing with any kind of human convention, whether it's property, whether it's the family, whether it's social relations, whether it's political relations, they never engage in a descriptive philosophical theory where they're going to determine a priori what these institutions are.
Right.
They always engage in a normative investigation of what they should be. They recognize that these institutions are arbitrary.
Mm-hmm.
They're products of concatenated willing.
Yes.
There's no guarantee that any of them will exist, or that they'll stay the same, or that they won't vary, or that they'll have this or that form.
Yeah.
And that has implications for history. There
Yeah.
cannot be an a priori descriptive theory of history, but there can be a prescriptive theory of history. Now, what do I mean by that? And I think you get a clue of that if you look at Hegel's philosophy of right,
What it ought to be.
where where he begins by conceiving what are the institutions of self-determination, institutions of freedom. And then at the end, he has a discussion of history. And what is that history? It's a history of what has to happen in order for those institutions of freedom to come into being. That is something that we can think. All we need to know is what are those institutions which provide the kind of telos for that prescriptive history where we're concerned with what has to happen in order for those to arise. And where do they arise from? They arise from, in a sense, the plurality of human beings in a world of nature. That's what it's all going to start from. We have the starting point. We have the prescriptive endpoint. And try to think of what that would have to be. Now, in his lectures, Hegel makes the following claim that I think has been ignored and misinterpreted. He points out, look, in my lectures on the philosophy of history, I'm just going to take a kind of empirical judgment. Namely, in our age, the age where the Industrial Revolution, the rise of capitalism is underway, where the French Revolution and American revolutions have occurred, where the Protestant Reformation has taken place, where a kind of nuclear disengaged family is arising, where feudal institutions are being overturned.
Mm-hmm.
It is a matter of empirical fact that the institutions of freedom are beginning to arrive and are being fought for in the world today. Now, that's not a philosophical truth. That's an empirical judgment. But if we start with that, we can then say empirically, well, if indeed we can note that these are beginning to arise, we can now look back at recorded history and try to interpret it and think of it as a process in which these institutions have arisen, and try to think through what are the things that had to have occurred and did occur that allowed them to take place.
Right.
That doesn't mean they had to take place. It doesn't mean they won't be overturned. After all, any moment a meteor can be crashing on Earth and wipe out human civilization.
Yeah.
Or, who knows, religious fundamentalism could take over and reinstall a kind of feudalism.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Now, I think Marx is someone who never quite got it straight. What was the character of his investigation of capitalism and capital? He didn't realize, as I think Hegel and most philosophers have, that when you are conceiving by means of reason alone what an institution is, you're not conceiving something descriptive, you are conceiving something normative, prescriptive. Yeah. Now, what is prescriptive could have some descriptive power if what ought to be has come to be to some degree. Now, I think Marx, in his critique of political economy, he's focusing on economic relations, and he's trying to remedy the problem he sees with the political economists, Smith, Ricardo, and the like. Namely, they have tried to deal with the workings of the economy and conceive them by making use of relations they take to be natural proclivities, technical relations, aspects of a kind of natural metabolism between man and nature. But we're dealing here with social relations. And the critique of political economy, as Marx is undertaking it, is attempting to think through market relations and the way in which capital arises in them and becomes the dominating dynamic as something that involves social relations, not natural relations, not relations of the human organism and nature. Here we're speaking about a very specific kind of social interaction. And if you look at how Marx operates in Capital, he's not engaged in a kind of model building of a social scientist. Where what are they doing? They're looking at the empirical reality and they're building a model that will apply to it. Capital has a kind of conceptual development to it. He's thinking through what are the most minimal structures of the reality of a market economy and how they, in a sense, give rise to one another. And it's a conceptual development. But if it's a conceptual development, then what is being conceived is something that has a normative character. Now, that doesn't mean that commodity relations in and of themselves and the rise of capital in the market is inherently just, because it could be that those relations have to be intervened upon, both privately and publicly,
right,
to ensure that all participants in the market can exercise their market freedoms.
get in
Mhm.
their
and that
fair
other institutions,
share.
such as the emancipated family and
So
self-government, can
whether it's
avoid having their equal opportunities undermined by what happens in the relations of the economy.
whether it's prescriptive or descriptive,
Yeah,
and whether it's Hegel or Marx in this case,
yeah.
isn't it always going to be some sort of hindsight recognition of something where we introspect on what has happened, and then we could either make the descriptive and or prescriptive. I mean, what was it? The owl of something flies at dusk, says Hegel. Owl of Minerva, I think it
Well,
was, flies at dusk. I mean, this is a retrospective. I mean,
well,
that,
I mean, look, he makes remarks of that sort, and I think if you take him literally, it's contradicted by what he's doing. Because if you look at his philosophy of right and what he, despite the fact that aspects of his discussion of the family and of society and of the state remain constrained by importations of pre-modern feudal relationships of various sorts. Nonetheless, he's conceiving things that had not yet come into being as
Mm.
part and parcel of his conception. And we're not bound by that. We can conceive things that are not what has been realized. Plato could do so in the Republic in many respects.
mhm.
We can do so. Um, I've attempted to think through normative economics in two books. One is called The Just Economy, the other is called Rethinking Capital, and to try to present the normative account of what these institutions should be. And to take into account, I think, something that Marx made a contribution to, which is to understand the way in which the workings of commodity relations automatically give rise to profit-seeking enterprise, and that
Yes.
results in a kind of polarity between employee and employer,
Yeah,
Yes.
Marx was
where
able to
employers
predict
have
very
a
well.
much higher degree of
Yeah.
economic power, and that has to be remedied if the very rights that require markets for their operation are to really be realized.
Well, like you
But,
said, I
but
mean,
we can think about how they can be realized through appropriate private
right,
intervention,
right.
through such things as universal trade unions, worker co-determination, as you
Hmm.
have in countries in Northern Europe where workers have half the seats on corporate boards, and public intervention of all sorts. It's not
So
as if it's impossible to remedy this imbalance
we
without
can,
annihilating
sorry,
economic right.
we can predict is essentially what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I do this every day, and I'm not as megalomaniacal as Hegel, but I feel as though I'm very good at predicting whether it's human behavior, whether it's just nature and how certain things are going to act. I get that.
I'm not talking about prediction here. I'm
Okay,
talking about what
okay.
ought to be, and what ought to be need not be. And maybe it won't be in our
Well,
lifetime.
then let's take that.
Maybe it will never be
Well,
on our planet.
we don't have to predict the descriptive. We could think about what ought to be. Again, what
Yeah.
ought to be, that thought doesn't just spontaneously arise in our mind. It seems as though there's some introspection on the past in our empirical engagement with reality, or whatever, just our empirical engagement. That's when we make those prescriptive and normative claims based on things that I mean, put your hand on a stove.
Look,
Ow, I
look. The
ought
problem,
not do that. And we could do
look, the
this with
problem is
political theory, etc. So,
look, when you're dealing with what's normative can never be derived from simply what is given, because what is given need not be in accord with what ought to be. In fact, what ought to be may never have been realized on this lonely planet of ours.
Yeah, that's true.
We'll
what's the
think it
alternative if you're
precisely because reason is not bound by foundations. And when we have people like Nietzsche and postmodernists telling us that reason is conditioned, it's always beholden to arbitrary foundations, they're putting their foot in their mouth because they're making a very global, unconditioned claim, which
Yeah.
on their own terms they have no right to do.
They know that they know that it's the not that.
What
Yeah, I got you.
exactly? So
Yeah.
they can't possibly affirm in a powerful way what they're doing. In other words,
so
there's no way you can use any philosophical thinking to undermine
if we can't get an
the
ought
truth of
from an
philosophy.
if we can't get an
It makes
ought
no sense.
from an is, such as
Yeah,
Hume would point out,
yeah,
is
and
is
he's
the
right.
is the alternative simple in I mean, I get that, right?
Yeah.
Yet yet it happens, yet it's determined somehow. And is it just through this arbitrary, perhaps will to power, perhaps just pure sentiment? I
Well,
mean,
let me give you a shortcut of a reflection which will allow you, I think, to get on the road of understanding how what is right, what is normative in regard to conduct, consists in the reality of self-determination. And again, it has to do with the problem of foundationalism. If you want to say that conduct is not going to take its bearings from self-determination, but through something else, then you're regarding conduct as having a foundation, where it is determined by something other than itself, where it owes its validity to something else, that you have a foundation from which it derives its authority.
Yeah.
But then we turn to the foundation itself and ask, what
Yeah.
gives it its authority?
It seems like a criterion problem. Yeah.
Well, it has to validate itself. But then, in validating itself, it eliminates the distinction, the difference between what confers validity and what has validity. There's no escape from recognizing that validity resides in self-determination. And in terms of conduct, that means that if we want to know what ethics is about, it's not about finding a highest good, as Aristotle thought. It's about conceiving the reality of self-determination.
and I more or less get that, and I'm sorry for making you repeat yourself there. What
And
is
and by the way, that we can think of whether or not we live in the imperfect body politic we do in the United States or anywhere else on this planet.
what is the self? When you speak of self-determination,
Yeah. Well, if you think about
because you're
the
identifying,
self-determination,
you're giving
the
it some
self-determination
identity, right?
of an agent, the self-determining agent has several different facets. On the one hand, the self-determining agent has a given species being. Now, that species being may not be being a Homo sapien; it could be something else. But whatever it is, and of course, I see no reason not to accord the reality of self-determination to beings in galaxies far, far away,
Sure.
who are not Homo sapiens. They do, however, have at least an animal organism that is sentient, that is able to control its body in a unified way, that has a choosing will by nature, and then is in a position to enter into those interrelationships in which individuals now acquire a further identity. We all have a species being. We all have an identity we're born with. We all have, in some respect, an identity through what our parents have done to us, what our culture has done to us, and so forth. But we can then enter into relationships whereby we give ourselves a new persona.
Yeah.
It doesn't
Yeah.
eliminate the other persona, but I determine myself as a citizen.
Is that a foundation or a presupposition that we have an identity?
Well, we have enabling conditions without which we couldn't engage in property rights, property relations, economic relations, political relations.
Right.
We have to have an animal body. We have to be able to have linguistic intelligence and to be able to communicate with others and be able to express and think what is universal. Otherwise, we couldn't know or exercise rights in any way. Those are enabling conditions, but they do not determine what it is right to do or what is wrong to do, because
Yeah, that's the
those
is.
conditions,
Yeah.
and that, by the way, applies to the same thing regarding language, consciousness, and other enabling conditions of our reasoning. Language is something that we need in order to think, but
Yes.
language cannot possibly dictate what we think to be true. And that would make no sense, because then we couldn't possibly have any knowing that was not conditioned and relative.
Yeah, without
And
language.
language, by the way, is a medium that is autonomous precisely because, as Chomsky would say, it has a generative grammar.
Yes.
In the grammar we have, we can create an infinite number of novel propositions and sentences. And
Yes.
the
That's right.
lexicon or vocabulary can always be added to and modified.
That's right.
Language is not a cage, and it can't be a cage. But the same thing with consciousness. I can't know anything without being conscious, but my consciousness is just as much the condition of my mistaken beliefs.
Yeah.
All these
That's true.
things, in other words, are enabling conditions, but not juridical conditions. And that's true with regard to all the things that make it possible for us to be citizens of Nazi Germany or citizens of a a more bona fide democracy. The same things have to be there, but they're not going to determine, what we take to be right.
So the enabling conditions of maybe growing up in a in a poor community won't have any direct determinate causes on your prescriptive and normative claims that you end up making later in life, whether you choose to rob someone or whatever. Those enabling conditions won't have any determinate
Yeah, I mean, look,
causation on your autonomy.
you're in a situation where you're facing pressures different from those of people who are not in those circumstances. What you choose to do, on the other hand, is not unilaterally determined by that, nor what you think about those conditions, or whether you want to continue to live under such conditions,
Unless neuroscience
right?
tells us that everything is causally determined.
Well, but then, saying all of that would not be supportable if
Well, yeah,
our
sure.
knowing were causally determined, because it
I
would be conditioned.
I take
There'd be
a
no guarantee
I take
that
a
what it was conditioned to
Pascalian.
be could be truthful or
I take
accurate or anything else.
I
Sure, I
take
get
the
what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So I
Perry.
think so. I think this reason, one of the problems with foundational epistemology or the whole transcendental turn is it takes enabling conditions as if they were juridical, as if they determine what we take to be true. Rather, they're pointing to things that are factors without which we couldn't think the truth. We need to have a biosphere in which we can survive. I need to have eaten enough food so I can think properly. I need to have had oxygen and water. I need to not have people tormenting me so I have no time to collect my thoughts or whatever, right? I mean, there are all sorts of conditions without which I can't engage in the quest for truth. But providing those enabling conditions does not dictate what I'm going to think. And if we're dealing with the truth, it can't be something that's dictated. It's going to be something engaged in through an autonomous investigation that is not beholden to any givens or authorities or conditions, and which is not to say we all live in the same we don't live in the same circumstances and the like. I mean, look, think of the history of philosophy
Mm-hmm.
in both East and West. Until very recently, there were hardly any women who played any significant roles.
Yeah.
Why? Well, the circumstances of life of women were such. Very few were illiterate. Very few had any opportunity
Yeah, they got will
to
to
be
power.
educated, to engage in discourse, to make public anything they were thinking, etc. Right? That, of course, doesn't mean that gender has anything to do with what you take to be true or your ability to think the truth.
Yeah.
But there are these different situations and the like, and I think that we are in a position to not be worried about those who want to belittle reason, because you cannot coherently belittle reason. You cannot in any coherent way bar
Well, if you
growth
belittle
of
reason, you're
philosophy.
using reason to belittle reason, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like Wittgenstein, who wants to cure us of philosophy by
Yeah.
engaging in a certain kind of philosophizing.
Everything's
It's
language.
ridiculous. It's ludicrous. And
Yeah.
yet that is, shall we say, one version of the ruling orthodoxy that has a stranglehold on academic philosophy. And unfortunately is teaching this stuff to legions of students.
Well, I mean, but you're giving them such robust information that, I think anybody would do well in your class. We're coming up on the hour mark right
Okay.
now. Is there, what I was going to say is, do you want to plug any of your books? Because I don't know their names. I'm sorry.
Okay. Let me plug a few things.
Yes, please.
One is, look, you can just look me up on Amazon, Richard Dean Winfield. You'll see all my books, all 24 of them. There's a little article in Wikipedia on me. It lists all my books. I also have on archive.org about recordings of about 26, 27 classes that are there free. Thousands of people have been listening to them. I have a podcast called America Unchained, which I did when I was running for office, because I ran for the House of Representatives, U.S. House of Representatives in 2018 from Georgia's
Oh,
10th Congressional District. And I ran for the U.S. Senate in the special election in 2020 on a federal job guarantee social rights agenda. And I wrote a book, somewhat philosophical, arguing in behalf of that agenda, saying a little bit about the campaign, which is called Democracy Unchained. And again, all these things are offered on Amazon,
you
ebook,
said Democracy Unchained? Is that what you
Democracy
said?
Unchained. And
Unchained. Okay.
I've written a ton of books on all areas that philosophy addresses.
That's
I'm
excellent.
inspired by Hegel, but I'm not I don't want to think of myself as a Hegel scholar. I
No,
want
I
to
mean,
think that Hegel should be what we should be doing, as
you've
inspired by
covered the
the
whole
five
gamut. I mean, you're in the philosophy of mind, you're in metaphysics, I mean, you seem to have
philosophy
your
traditions.
toes in all of
Well,
the
look,
different pots.
isn't that true of philosophy of any philosopher of stature? I'm not going to say that I am that, but
No, you
Plato,
are.
Aristotle, Descartes, Kant,
Yes.
Hegel, they all, none of them were specialists. Yet this
Yeah.
philosophy profession is organized. So when you go look for a job, you have to say you have an area of specialty. Did
Yeah.
Hegel have an area of specialty? Did Kant have an area of specialty? Did
Yeah.
Descartes, Hume? No, none of them did. It's ridiculous.
And Plato and Socrates and Aristotle definitely didn't.
Descartes was a mathematician.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. One last question, and
yeah, sure.
if you want to go into it further, you're more than welcome to stay, and we'll stay on longer. I just
I don't
didn't
mind.
want to keep you
Yeah,
too long.
go on.
So self-determinism,
Yeah,
or the self itself, if
yeah.
we can make that construct of that reality in our minds to just understand this, that's not a first principle.
No,
Okay.
it's not a first principle, but it's that in which is the very substance of what is valid in conduct. And
Hmm.
autonomous reason is that in which truth is determined.
Maybe I don't understand autonomous reason. Can you explain
Sure.
autonomous reason to me?
Yeah. Well, look, I think philosophical reason is autonomous. In
Oh, okay.
this dual sense, it is not going to take its marching orders from anything else outside it. It's not going to bow down to religious authority, to custom,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
It is going to call everything into question and exercise that negative freedom of not being bound by any givens. But then it also has to generate from itself anything that's to count for it. It is to establish its own method. It is to establish its own subject matter, right?
Hmm.
These are themselves philosophical questions.
Yeah.
So a philosophy that presumes that it's already determined before we engage in philosophy is not really philosophical.
It's doomed to fail, is what you're saying.
Yeah, well, can't get at truth.
Yeah, it can't get at what is most likely true. Yeah.
Now, likewise, when you talk about conduct and the reality of self-determination, which is a system in which we need self-government and democratic institutions. I discussed what these are at length in a book called The Just State, Rethinking Self-Government.
Yeah.
You can't have self-government unless the citizens also have their pre-political freedoms upheld. In other words, if you are facing oppression in the household, that's going to prevent you from having equal opportunity as a citizen.
Correct.
It's also going to prevent you from engaging in social freedom on a par with others.
Yeah.
You can't be in a society which is dominated by various forms of oppression and be able to exercise your rights as a citizen on a par with others.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So in these ways, and this was part of my political campaign, we can't have self-government unless our social freedoms and our household freedoms are recognized and enforced, which, by the way, the American Constitution, influenced by social contract theory, which restricts freedom to property rights and a civil authority that upholds property rights, completely neglects all of our family freedoms and social freedoms, which have no constitutional guarantees whatsoever. There's no right to education. There's no right to work. There's no right to balancing work and family,
Mm-hmm.
balancing employer-employee, et cetera, healthcare, whatever, right?
Yeah.
But we can't be free as citizens without these things. And this is a matter that is exposed by thinking through what is the reality of self-determination. And because self-determination is what it is through the activities of the exercise of rights, it doesn't derive from anything outside itself. In fact, the Constitution is something that's part and parcel of the just state. It's not something lying outside it. It's part of the fabric. It's something within the state whereby it articulates for its citizens what are their fundamental rights. And what it is to qualify as a citizen has nothing to do with matters that are determined independently of the practice of self-government. In other words, your right as a citizen is not something that is to be derived from any kind of ancestry, any kind of linguistic identity, any kind of class identity, any kind of gender, any kind of linguistic identity.
Yeah.
It's a matter of participating in a certain constitutional order. And I think the United States has as one of its very strong points that it is not a nation state. We are not a state as France was, as England was, etc.
Yeah.
Where the citizenry was constituted by a pre-political cultural identification. We are a nation of, well, people from all sorts of different ethnicities, backgrounds.
Yeah, we're a nation of immigrants.
And that means our identity as a citizen is given independently of any of those cultural factors, as it should be.
It's socially constructed from the Constitution and what they agreed upon and what we continue to uphold. Yeah.
Now, by the way, I think it's important to distinguish between the social and the political.
Okay.
Although one can use the term social to refer to any kinds of, let's say, intersubjective relations, which would include the household as well as
any intersubjective activity. Right. Yeah.
But here, the Constitution is something political, not social, right?
Okay.
And and of course, that's part and parcel of the extent of social rights. Civil society, in a way, has a kind of global character, and economic interaction can extend throughout the globe, and the rights that pertain to members of civil society are different from the rights that pertain to citizens, that pertain to a particular body politic to which one belongs.
That's. I wish I knew more about this to be able to comment with you, but I don't. I'm not the political guy.
Well, one thing, and
go ahead, Perry, and then we'll start wrapping it up. Go ahead, Perry.
I've somewhat zoned out, but I heard social and political, and I know that we've talked about Hegel and whatnot. And Kant thought that nations, along with angels and God, could be rational beings, and humans, of course. And, you've heard me go through the spiel on the distinction between phenomena and noumena, nature and freedom, right? And so, again, that was just kind of there's not much that I can say to that which I didn't pay much attention to in the past.
It's okay,
minutes,
buddy.
But
it's okay, buddy. He was laying out for the viewers and everything.
I'm sure Richard has something perhaps to say on that.
Sure.
And Hegel also, the whole thing with rationality and freedom.
You're pointing to something very important. For Kant, as you're noting, anything pertaining to freedom is what he calls noumenal. It's not something we can know objectively.
Right.
And that really is that's really quite perverse, because it means we cannot know that there are any other free agents out there in our domain of experience. And the reason underlying that is, if you take the transcendental turn and make the structure of knowing determinative of what counts as an object, all objects are determined by the structure of our knowing. They are subject to it. They are necessitated through it. And that means that the domain of objects is going to be subject to laws of nature. Why? Because every object is subject to the same epistemological foundation, which gives it its objectivity. So that applies to objects no matter what they are. Kant is always talking about, any possible object of experience. Laws apply to all objects no matter what they are. So for Kant, objectivity is a lawful nature governed by an external necessity. It's not a nature such as Plato and Aristotle thought of, where you had species and genera, which had a rational character, where we could know the nature of something. and derive certain things from its concept. For Kant, that's impossible.
Hmm.
But that also means nature can't contain living things that have this self-activity of life, which is not something that only exhibits efficient causality. It has an internal telos. You can't have subjects in the true sense of the term in this objectivity, which is all we can know. So how can we engage in any kind of ethical relations or moral relations when we can't possibly know that there's another subject? How can we even be self-conscious when we can't be aware of ourselves in the world as having any genuine autonomy?
Yeah.
These are perplexities that Kant is stuck with,
Yeah.
and they apply to anyone who makes that kind of maneuver.
Yeah. And I think Kant is a good place to end on, as always.
Okay. Right?
No, Richard, you've been fantastic, and we're going to have a little closing session here. Perry, did you want to say anything else? Is there anything else you wanted to bring up before we started wrapping this up?
No, I don't think so. I mean, when you were talking about laws of nature, and you brought up Plato, and there's something called physis. Kind of sounds like physics, spelled with ph. Those are the laws of nature, and then there's
Well, that's
nomos.
just, yeah. Physis is nature for the Greek. That's the ancient Greek word for nature.
That's
Oh,
That's
I
all it
learned
is.
something new there.
that's all I got. Thanks.
And that's
Good
why
ending.
metaphysics has a peculiar character. It's simply that which appeared after Aristotle's philosophy of nature or physics
Yeah, after
in the
physics.
first
Yeah,
edition of his works.
yeah. Richard, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. I hope you had a good time, and I definitely had a good time. You've taught me a lot, so I appreciate the free lesson. Thank you very much. We will have you back again anytime you want to schedule
Okay.
a book with us. Please feel free to, because we'd love to
I'd,
talk to you again.
I'd be happy.
Absolutely. So, everybody, thanks for coming to the show. Thanks for all future viewers, and hope you enjoy. And please subscribe to the Pangburn Universe on YouTube. It's also Pangburn at YouTube. And you can subscribe to my channel. I'm Thomas Panter. And you can just type that in and you'll find it. And also, please look at all of Richard's works. You can go back in this video and find where he mentions most of his works. Available on Amazon. Is that right, Richard?
Yeah, they're all on Amazon.com.
All on Amazon. Just look up Richard Dean Winfield. And guys, please go buy his stuff. Please go support him, okay? Well, we thank all y'all for showing up, and we love you. And have a good night.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed it. Thanks for
Thank you,
having me
Richard.
on. Bye.
We need to be able to have conversations without feeling like we're going to say something that gets us thrown in jail because people happen to be offended.